Terrifying urban legend story, The Hollow Man of Birch Hollow. Prologue, a warning ignored. Birch Hollow was the kind of town you'd miss if you blinked while driving through. The locals were tight-lipped, wary of outsiders, and the place had a reputation for its strange, insidious history. The legend of the Hollow Man was whispered like a curse. They said he was a spectral figure, drawn to despair, feeding on grief and loss. I wasn't from Birch Hollow, but when my childhood friend Sarah asked me to visit after the sudden death of her husband, I couldn't say no. She had moved to this rural place to escape the chaos of city life, but now she sounded broken. "Something's wrong," she whispered over the phone. "It's the Hollow Man." I laughed it off, assuming it was her grief talking. I was wrong. The arrival. When I pulled up to Sarah's farmhouse, it was just past dusk. The air felt thick, oppressive, as though the surrounding woods were pressing in. Sarah greeted me at the door, her eyes sunken and her frame thinner than I remembered. Her toddler, Ellie, clung to her leg, wide-eyed and silent. "I've been hearing him," she said without preamble. "Every night, he calls from the woods. He wants to come inside." "Sarah, it's just the grief," I replied, trying to comfort her. "You're exhausted. This place can mess with your mind." She shook her head vehemently. "No, he's real. If you don't believe me, just stay the night." Night 1. The knocking. That first night, the house was eerily quiet. I took the guest room upstairs, directly across from Ellie's nursery. Sarah's room was down the hall. Exhausted from the drive, I fell asleep quickly. I woke to a sound at 3 a.m. Knock, knock, knock. It was faint but deliberate, coming from the front door. Groggy, I got out of bed, assuming Sarah had gone to investigate. Instead, I found her standing in the living room, clutching a kitchen knife. "You hear it, don't you?" she whispered. I nodded. My skepticism wavered as the knocking grew louder. Then, a voice, low and rasping, echoed through the night. "Let me in." Every hair on my body stood on end. The voice was neither human nor animal, a guttural thing that seemed to resonate in the marrow of my bones. Sarah's grip on the knife tightened. "He can't come in unless we invite him," she said. "That's what they say. That's why the doors and windows are always locked." The knocking stopped abruptly, but the voice continued, whispering things I couldn't make out. Sarah grabbed my arm. "Don't listen too closely. That's how he gets in your head. The town's secret." The next day, Sarah insisted we visit the town's library. She believed the answer to defeating the Hollow Man lay buried in old folklore. The librarian, an older woman named Mrs. Greaves, initially dismissed our questions, but her demeanor changed when Sarah mentioned the voice. "You've heard him?" Mrs. Greaves whispered, visibly shaken. "Then it's already too late." Reluctantly, she pulled a dusty tome from a locked cabinet. The legend dated back to the early settlers of Birch Hollow. A man accused of witchcraft had been lynched in the woods, his body burned and scattered to the wind. As he died, he cursed the land and vowed to return, hollow and vengeful, to feed on the sorrows of the living. "The Hollow Man preys on grief," Mrs. Greaves explained. "He lures his victims with whispers, takes their sanity first, and then their souls. Once he's chosen someone, he doesn't stop." Night 2. Ellie's laughter. That night, I sat with Sarah in the living room, the knife still in her lap. We barely spoke, our nerves frayed from lack of sleep and the weight of what we'd learned. Around midnight, we heard Ellie's laughter upstairs. Sarah bolted up the stairs, and I followed close behind. When we entered the nursery, Ellie was sitting in her crib, staring at the window. "Mommy, the man says he's sorry," she said, pointing. "He says he didn't mean to hurt Daddy." Sarah froze, her face pale. I rushed to the window, but there was nothing outside, just the dense, shadowy woods. I pulled the curtains shut and turned to Sarah. "We need to leave," I said firmly, but Sarah shook her head. "He'll follow. We have to end this here." The confrontation. We decided to follow Mrs. Greaves's advice. According to the lore, the Hollow Man could be banished by confronting him in the place he was created. Armed with flashlights and trembling resolve, we ventured into the woods. The deeper we went, the colder it became. The trees seemed to close in, their skeletal branches clawing at the night sky. Then, we found it, a clearing with a gnarled tree at its center, its bark blackened as though it had been burned. "Show yourself," Sarah yelled into the darkness. The fog rolled in, thick and choking. And then he appeared. The Hollow Man was no longer a man. His form was skeletal, his face a shifting void where features should have been. He wore tattered remnants of 18th-century clothing, and his voice, that awful rasping whisper, seemed to come from everywhere at once. "You called me here," he said, his tone mocking. "I only wanted to comfort you." Sarah stepped forward, clutching a locket that had belonged to her husband. She hurled it at the base of the tree. The Hollow Man recoiled, his form distorting and flickering like a broken projection. "Leave us alone," Sarah screamed. With an ear-splitting wail, the Hollow Man dissolved into the fog, which dissipated as quickly as it had come. The aftermath. We returned to the house in silence, exhausted but hopeful. For the first time in weeks, Sarah slept peacefully. The next morning, Ellie ran around the house laughing, free of the shadow that had lingered over her. But I'm not so sure we truly banished him. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear faint whispers outside my window. Terrifying urban legend story, the murmurs of Stonehaven Creek. Nestled deep within the dense woods of Appalachia was the forgotten town of Stonehaven Creek, a place that thrived on folklore and whispered warnings passed down through generations. Locals believe that some legends were born not of imagination but of horrifying truths. One such tale was that of the Murmuring Fog. The first night, the return, my arrival at Stonehaven Creek was not entirely voluntary. I had inherited my uncle's decrepit house on the outskirts of the town, a ramshackle place cloaked in ivy and half buried under layers of neglect. I intended to sell it quickly and leave, but strange occurrences began almost immediately. The first night, while I unpacked my belongings, I heard faint whispers outside my window. At first, I dismissed it as the sound of the wind curling through the forest. Yet, as I paused to listen, the murmurs took on a sinister rhythm, like voices threading together a song in an unknown language. I went to the window, pushing aside the moth-eaten curtain. A thick fog crept in, swallowing the gravel driveway and encircling the house like a noose. In its swirling depths, I thought I saw shapes, humanoid yet distorted, drifting and disbanding, like smoke caught in an invisible wind. My skin prickled as I heard a low voice hiss my name, "William?" The journal. The next day, I found my uncle's journal buried under stacks of yellowed newspapers in the attic. The entry spoke of the same fog and murmuring voices. "It calls to those who wander too far," he had written. "The murmuring fog doesn't kill you outright. It takes your mind, piece by piece, until nothing human remains." My unease grew as I flipped through the pages. The final entry read, "I see them watching from the trees, the silhouettes. They whisper promises of freedom, but I know the truth. They're the lost souls of those who came before me. Tonight, I shall meet them in the fog." The town's warning. Seeking answers, I ventured into town. Stonehaven Creek was not what I expected. Its streets were empty, and its buildings bore the marks of decay. Only a single shop remained open, a dimly lit general store cluttered with dust-covered cans and trinkets. The shopkeeper, a wiry man with sunken eyes, froze when I mentioned my uncle's name. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice trembling. "Your uncle. He went into the fog. He's one of them now." "One of what?" I demanded. He didn't answer directly, instead recounting the legend. Centuries ago, settlers had angered the forest spirits by clearing sacred land. As punishment, the spirits sent the fog to reclaim their domain. Anyone caught within it would be trapped, their soul torn from their body and left to wander forever. A terrible discovery. That evening, the fog returned, thicker and more menacing than before. Determined not to succumb to fear, I ventured outside with a flashlight and a knife. The whispers grew louder, their rhythm like a haunting lullaby. As I moved further into the fog, my flashlight flickered, and the air turned colder. I stumbled upon an old stone altar etched with grotesque symbols. Surrounding it were bones, human bones, piled high in grotesque formations. My breath caught as I realized the bones weren't entirely old. Some still bore the fresh marks of decay. "William!" the voice hissed again, closer this time. I turned sharply and found myself face to face with a figure. It was my uncle, or at least what remained of him. His features were gaunt, his skin stretched unnaturally tight, and his eyes glowed with a pale, unearthly light. "They will take you too," he whispered, his voice overlapping with dozens of others. "There's no escape." The final night, I fled back to the house, but the fog pursued me, seeping through every crack and crevice. The whispers had grown deafening, an endless cacophony of voices overlapping, pleading, threatening, desperate. I barricaded myself in the attic and pored over my uncle's journal. The last few pages described a ritual, a way to appease the spirits and banish the fog, temporarily, at least. But the cost was steep, a human sacrifice. I had no choice. The ritual. As dawn approached, I lured the shopkeeper to the house under the pretense of needing his help. Guilt clawed at me as I led him into the woods, but survival overpowered morality. Together, we approached the altar. He didn't suspect a thing until it was too late. The moment the blood touched the stone, the fog recoiled, writhing as if in agony. The whispers faded, replaced by an otherworldly wail that echoed through the forest. But the silence that followed was not comforting. I realized too late that the ritual did not banish the fog. It merely transferred its curse. I felt it then, slithering into my mind. A cold, insidious presence burrowing deep. The aftermath. I never left Stonehaven Creek. The fog never returned, but its whispers never truly left me. Every night, I hear them calling from the edges of the forest, promising escape if I only step into the darkness. I know now why my uncle stayed. You can leave Stonehaven Creek, but its curse will follow. And one day, the fog will come for you, too. Terrifying urban legend story. The Echoes in Blackwell Tunnel. Prologue. A passage too quiet. Every small town has its ghost stories, but few are as haunting as the legend of the Blackwell Tunnel. It was said to be cursed, a passage beneath the mountain where strange echoes were known to follow travelers. The locals would warn, if you hear your name called in the tunnel, don't answer. If you do, you'll never leave. I never believed in any of it until that cold, rainy night when my car broke down at its entrance. The first sign. I had been driving cross-country for work when the GPS directed me toward a shortcut through Blackwell Tunnel. My coworkers had mentioned the route in passing, describing it as eerie but faster. I didn't think twice, just another road in another rural town. The rain was relentless, hammering my windshield, and as I approached the tunnel, my car sputtered and died. The headlights dimmed, leaving me in darkness. My phone's flashlight barely pierced the gloom as I stepped out, cursing my luck. The tunnel loomed ahead, a gaping mouth carved into the mountain. Water dripped from its arched ceiling, creating shallow puddles that mirrored the faint glow of my flashlight. That's when I heard it, a soft, distant whisper. At first, I thought it was the wind or perhaps my imagination, but then it came again, clearer this time. "Help me." Inside the tunnel. Against my better judgment, I ventured inside. The air was damp and cold, and the further I went, the quieter the world outside became. My flashlight flickered, its weak beam dancing over graffiti-covered walls and rusted pipes. The whispering grew louder, echoing off the stone walls. "Help me." It was a woman's voice, strained and trembling. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe someone was stranded like me. Maybe they needed help. "Hello?" I called out, my voice bouncing back in distorted fragments. "Is anyone there?" The response was immediate, as if the tunnel itself spoke. "Turn back." The forgotten story. At the midpoint of the tunnel, I found something strange. A small alcove carved into the wall, barely big enough for a person to stand in. Inside was a pile of old belongings, a rusted bicycle, a child's shoes, a cracked porcelain doll. It was like a shrine, eerie and misplaced. The whispers turned into murmurs, overlapping voices speaking in tones too low to decipher. They came from every direction, as though the tunnel were alive. That's when I remembered the legend someone had mentioned in passing. Decades ago, a family had vanished in Blackwell Tunnel, They were last seen entering it during a storm, but no trace of them was ever found. Some said the spirits of the lost lingered there, seeking to lure others into the darkness. The voices take shape. I turned to leave, my heart racing, but the whispers followed me. Then came the unmistakable sound of footsteps, wet, slapping against the puddles behind me. I froze and turned, shining my flashlight into the void. Nothing. Who's there? My voice cracked. A new voice emerged, one I recognized. It's me. My brother's voice. My brother who had died in a car accident 2 years ago. Michael, I whispered, tears springing to my eyes. Is that you? Yes, the voice replied, echoing faintly. Help me, please. Don't leave me here. The air grew heavier, and I felt a pull, a deep, gut-wrenching urge to go back. But I remembered the warning. Never answer, never follow. The final test. I ran toward the exit, the tunnel stretching endlessly before me. The voices grew louder, more insistent. They called my name in the tones of people I loved. My mother, my best friend, even my own voice echoed back at me. Don't leave us. Please come back. I covered my ears, but it did little to muffle the sound. My legs burned as I pushed forward, desperate to escape. The end of the tunnel was in sight, a faint glow of moonlight breaking through the rain. That's when I heard it again. Turn around? This time, the voice was right behind me. Against every instinct, I glanced over my shoulder. For a moment, I saw them. Shadowy figures with hollow eyes, their mouths gaping open as if in a silent scream. They reached out with skeletal hands, their forms shifting and writhing like smoke. Escape. I burst out of the tunnel, falling to my knees in the gravel outside. The rain had stopped, and the night was eerily quiet. My car was still there, headlights dimly flickering, as though it had never died in the first place. Shaking, I climbed into the driver's seat and turned the key. The engine roared to life as if nothing had happened. I drove without looking back, my hands trembling on the wheel. The aftermath. I never told anyone about what happened in Blackwell Tunnel. When I tried to explain it to myself, I could only conclude one thing. The legend was real. The voices had nearly taken me, but I escaped by some cruel twist of fate. Weeks later, I read a news article about a local man who had gone missing. His car was found abandoned at the entrance to Blackwell Tunnel. Search parties found no trace of him. I knew then that the tunnel didn't just echo voices, it stole people, and it was still waiting for its next victim.